So first is that I think addressing that you want to change and finding somebody or a system or a method or a way where you can embrace the change that you want initially. So as a coach, you probably do the same. You meet people where they're at, right? So if I was to say at the time, join AA, which to me wasn't anonymous to me, that felt fearful. That was, I just didn't believe I wanted that goal of total abstinence. I just wasn't open-minded to that because it wasn't the goal where I wanted to be. So I wanted to find a way to get to where I wanted to go. And initially, 50% less was where I wanted to be. That felt safe. That felt like doable. That felt like you weren't taking away I call it, alcohol was my adult pacifier. It was like my binky.
Hey there, and welcome back to another episode of the Reshape Your Health podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Morgan Nolte, and on today's episode, we're talking about alcohol and habit change. So, if you've been following the show for a while, you know that I have pretty much never been a big drinker. But since a recent episode, I think it was with James Swanwick, I pretty much stopped drinking nearly entirely and have not missed it. You also know that habit change, behavior change, thought change is one of my favorite things to discuss. So, this episode is going to be wonderful. Our guest today is Dr. Sherry Price. She's a clinical pharmacist, certified life and weight loss coach, and host of the Health Habits and Epic Living podcast. Sherry's work is dedicated to helping women take charge of their health and wellness through lifestyle, mindset, and habit change. Through her multiple coaching programs and podcasts, she has helped thousands of women up-level their mindset, ditch bad habits, and revitalize their energy through food, fitness, and healthy relationships so that they can live their most epic version of themselves. Sherry, thank you for coming on the show. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Same, Morgan. Thank you for having me.
Of course. Well, let's start with that background about your history going from being a clinical pharmacist and what that really entailed. How did you end up in this health coaching space?
Oh, it was such an interesting journey. I practiced in many areas of pharmacy and hospital, pharmaceutical industry, teaching at a university, and then I had my own business for a while. And it was when I was kind of closing out that business, I went through some hard times. There was a diagnosis of a neurodivergent nature for my young daughter, and then selling, your company. So a lot of stress, a lot of things that were going on in my life. And my drinking ramped up during that phase. I used to drink to take the edge off at the end of the day and just feel like, this is, a good life, right? It's something you get to do as an adult. And then that drinking would kick up as I was going through these stressful times, not knowing how to manage it, not knowing when the end was going to be in sight, not knowing how to get the best care for my daughter at the time. So, when that started to pick up, I thought this would be temporary, right? And then trying multiple modalities to cut back on my drinking, and having them be successful short term, but just not really successful long term. Like I continue to go back to what I would call the same habit of over drinking, which to me is drinking more than you want. And you're actually starting to experience negative consequences from it. So that could be just like forgetting conversations or, um, not remembering what you said, doing things or saying things because your filter is kind of gone, like things that you wouldn't normally have said, or just not feeling good about yourself the next day. So, after multiple attempts to cut back on my own and not being successful, I was like, how else can I do this in a way that wouldn't jeopardize my pharmacy career? Because
Got
obviously,
it.
a pharmacist with any type of substance use disorder could put my reputation at risk, could put my job at risk if when I sold the company and what was I going to do next. So I got coached I got a coach to do this because I wanted to take care of it confidentially where it didn't hit my
Mhm.
medical record. There was no, I'm seeing a mental health therapist and all of a sudden it's going through insurance. And I was just worried that some of that would come back to haunt me. So it was during that time where I fell in love with coaching because my coach had taught me how to do behavior change, how to, think about things differently, where my desire for alcohol actually diminished.
Yeah.
And once I learned these tools, I thought, wow, this is so interesting that you can really change habits through your mind. And I wanted to learn way more about that. So I became a coach and initially started helping people with their alcohol misuse. So I didn't plan on becoming a coach. I thought just go and pick up another area of pharmacy. But when I found this, I became so intrigued and thought, this is amazing. And I really wanted to teach others.
Yeah. So how long did it take you to go from alcohol misuse to using it intentionally? And what did that look like specifically for you? Like, how many drinks were you having a week or a day? And then did you have to cut it out completely or taper down? And then what does your alcohol intake look like these days?
Great questions. Yeah. So back then, I would drink mostly most nights of the week. So with that would be probably 5 or 6. And generally it was a glass or two of wine. And I thought really nothing of it at that time. Didn't feel like I was getting any negative consequences from that kind of use. I felt like my liver, my metabolism was able to handle it. Then when I went through the stressful time, then it ratcheted up to maybe that half a bottle became now a full bottle, or half a bottle, then I wanted a cocktail, or just would get so mad at my emotions that I just didn't want to feel those emotions. So I would say the drinks per week, anywhere between 35 drinks a week to maybe 40 was typical. And then, I tried multiple ways to cut back, right? I read a lot of books. I love to learn. I listen to podcasts of people who've been on their journey. I tried, the sober Octobers, the dry Januaries, and thinking, why hasn't 30 days changed this
Yeah.
behavior? Then I started researching habit change and all of that. And then through the process of working with my coach, we got to a point where my drinking was probably 50% less within 4, 5 months, I'd say, which felt huge. It felt
Yeah.
huge. It felt like I wanted to stay there. So I was doing about 10 to 12 drinks, so more than 50% less. And I thought that was fine. Like I felt that was normal drinking. But then I'm like, when I started really researching and going, wow, this is still considered a heavy drinker. Like I didn't understand that that was considered heavy drinking because I was just in with friends who drank a lot. We'd come to each other's houses and bring a bottle of wine. It was just kind of in the culture.
Yeah.
So it's like a fish swimming in water. You just don't know. And I'm like, "Really? That seems still like a little lot." And I don't wanna shame myself, but maybe there's a way I can cut back even more. So, did some more work around that through different coaches and, really understood habit change and how to modify that. And so it took another few months to get me to a place where I was 6 to 8, and now I feel like I don't really want it that much. So it was for me a longer journey. But I have to say, probably the reason for that being is I didn't want to be so low initially. It just didn't come to know that I'd want to be drinking so much less. So,
Mhm.
so just on the journey, you learn more about yourself, and it's felt so fearful at first to have something taken away from you that brought you so much relief.
Yeah. So, what do you like? How did you deal with that? Because I think there's a lot of people listening to this who were where you were. And I think the whole fish swimming in water was perfect because we're desensitized to our own habits. And so, hearing somebody else's kind of bad habit puts a mirror up in front of their face and be like, oh, I'm in that heavy drinker phase, which I think is technically more than one drink a day for women. Is that correct?
Yes, yes, so more than 7 a
Yeah.
week. Mhm.
Yeah, so more than 1 a day for women, I think more than 2 a day for men. And we talk so much about metabolic health on this show, but I think something that I love talking about is just the difficulty of the habit change. And so, what advice would you give to somebody who was in your shoes, when you were in that stage of heavy drinking, that to kind of bring their awareness to it, or like maybe they're thinking about changing, but they're nervous to change? What advice would you give to them?
There's several things. So first is that I think addressing that you want to change and finding somebody or a system or a method or a way where you can embrace the change that you want initially. So as a coach, you probably do the same. You meet people where they're at, right?
Mhm.
So if I was to say at the time, join AA, which to me wasn't anonymous, to me that felt fearful. That was I just didn't believe I wanted that goal of total abstinence. I just wasn't open-minded to that because it wasn't the goal where I wanted to be. So I wanted to find a way to get to where I wanted to go. And initially, 50% less was where I wanted to be. That felt safe, that felt like doable, that felt like you weren't taking away my I call it, alcohol was my adult pacifier, it was like my binky, like I just
Mhm.
would, rely on it like Linus
Yeah.
relies on his blanket, right? For comfort, for joy, for, social lubrication, to open me up as an introvert, so it provided a role that I'm like, "Well, I don't really wanna cut it out of my life." So I think just knowing what you want and finding a method to get there. And
Yeah.
look, 50% less alcohol is still a huge benefit on your health.
Yeah,
Huge,
it
and on
is.
your metabolic health and on your waistline and on your brain cells and on the amount in your liver that your liver has to process. So don't and so that's the first part. Like really say this is where I want to go and this is the change I'm willing to make now.
Mhm.
And then you
So
don't know when you get there, you might want more change like what happened to me. And then the second piece I think is so important when it comes to alcohol, um, is addressing the shame piece. I think a lot of people have shame about, well, gosh, I drink so much, or I've been doing this for so long, or I have this hurt relationship, or I say things and I say I'm going to cut back, but I don't. And so my family gets mad or others get mad. And so we get this like internalized shame that I think is really important to start working through right from the beginning.
yeah. So, what techniques did your coach work through with you to really reduce that intake by 50%? Like, what are some of the first things that you started to do or implement to help you reduce your intake?
Yeah. So she did some things that worked for me. And I will just point that out that there are other methods that I've learned along the way that also would have worked, and that I find even more helpful. So initially, it was counting your drinks, being, everything's measurable, right? Count it. We don't know if we're improving unless we count it and measure. And then probably what maybe some of your audience, like your drink count becomes your shame. Right? It's like,
Yeah.
whoa, that 35. Your audience, I'm thinking like when I even work with people too, is around their metabolic health, right? The number on the scale. There's like shame
Mhm.
with that or some kind of judgment that comes with that. So I know initially I was for monitoring that because I do like data, but I know not everybody wants to start there. But that was helpful for me because I wanted to own my truth. I think
Mhm.
it's easy to put our head in the sand and say we're doing a good job and say we're trying and say we're wanting to be more healthy. But really, it comes down to like, is our behavior matching that?
Right.
Just because I have the intention doesn't mean my behavior is matching that. And really understanding it's the behavior that's going to get us where we want to go. And so I think looking at that behavior is very important. So that was one area. And then another area, which I focus more on, is what to do with that desire, what to do with that urge, and how to manage through that. So she was helpful in giving me one method to manage through that. And then I just expand upon that too. Is like there can be many ways you can handle an urge or a craving or that need for whatever it is. For a lot of my clients, it's like that need for stress relief or that need to feel like I can transition from work time to home time because generally the drinking starts around that 5 o'clock hour. When I get home from
Mhm.
work, I can let down, or it might be after I put the kids to bed and it's mommy time. And so, looking for that relief from the workday, that relief from everything falls on me or all the tasks, come back to me. And so working on ways to get that relief that doesn't require alcohol all the time.
Yeah. So what worked for you? You said you worked on some urge management
Mm.
strategies, and so you kinda had to develop different emotional coping
Yes.
strategies. So
Yes.
what was effective for you?
Yes. So we began to like really peel back what is the urge about because it could be like I mentioned the relief. And so I find that a lot of women particularly get caught up in a few emotions that really get them. So you may drink alcohol or eat for many reasons, but there's probably two or three that really drive your eating or really drive your drinking behavior. So like I might drink because it's a celebration. Um, but I probably in that scenario for me, I can stop myself after two. It's not a problem. Where I would get hung up and what I started to learn about myself was like my anger or my disappointment were the two big emotions that would cause me to overdrink all the time. So if I say I'm going to have one, I would have two or three or a whole bottle, right? So I like massively overdrank whenever I experienced anger or disappointment. And being quite a perfectionist, right? Those were two that would just, I just didn't know how to handle anger or understand how to handle disappointment in a way where I could still get relief and not have the intense desire for the alcohol to solve that for me.
I think this comes back to self-awareness, and I have to give an example from this morning. My husband and I were having a conversation about something, and it triggered the stress response in me. And I've never recognized this as clearly as I did today, where it was like we were talking about something that historically has stressed us out and led to a fight or an argument or a disagreement. And I was so proud of myself for being more self aware because I was able to articulate to him, like, this is not something that you said directly. This is me. This is like, I am in fight or flight right now. I feel my heart rate. I'm perspiring. We need to like not talk about this right now. And so instead of like turning to food or whatever, I would have turned to in the past, I was able just to like stare the emotion of like fight, flight, rejection, whatever it was in the face and just name it and sit in it and like create a healthy emotional boundary for the time being to have some space to feel that safety that I was craving to feel. Um, but I'm like, I'm 34 years old. And that was the first time that I actively identified the fight or flight response in my marriage. And I'm like, dang, there's people older than me that are probably experiencing these emotions. But when you can't name it, I've heard it before, like if you can't name it, you can't tame it. And so I think having that degree of self-awareness, taking a step back and being an observer of our emotions instead of like just trying to fix everything right now or completely shut down, it's like, what's happening here? Oh, I'm actually in the stress response. This is not a great time to talk to you. Let's take a break so that we don't make the situation worse. And so I think that was really resonating as you were talking through like the feelings of anger or disappointment. You would be driven to eat or not eat, but drink, but many people are driven to eat. And so recognizing those emotions is helpful. Like it's almost like you turn the light on and the mouse light runs away. So, what was helpful for you to retrain your brain to identify, okay, these are the emotions driving my drinking behavior? Was it like a journal, like you were tracking your drinks and then when you were drinking you were writing your emotion next to it or how did you work that out?
Yeah. So I had heard a similar quote, "If you can't feel it, you can't heal it."
Oh, I like that. I haven't heard of that
Yes.
one.
Yes, and, somebody who, highly educated, grades are everything, kind of grown up, that kind of indoctrinated into my brain, and, um, I I'm a very cognitive person. I'm very much a person in my head. So I joke with the ladies in my program. It's like we have to get below the neck. Like we're so busy
Mhm.
being in our heads, the to-do list, the kids need to go here, the social calendar's this. I got to make sure my husband remembers this, all these activities. And so we're in our head a lot.
Yeah.
But nobody's really taught me to feel. And in healthcare, right? You oftentimes um want to keep your feelings down so you can be more calm and wise in making decisions with your
Yeah.
patients, right? So I think I've just been indoctrinated just from growing up and how I practiced in a hospital. You just got to put those feelings down, and so I began to disconnect from my body,
Mm.
not realizing that there's, a downside to that. There's an upside to that professionally sometimes, but then there's also the downside. And when you drink or you eat, you become even more disconnected because you're allowing the food or the alcohol to give you feelings rather than relying on yourself to understand your own feelings and then how to change them. So for me, it was like really getting in touch with myself, really understanding what are those feelings and what does anger feel like in my body. I know
Mhm.
I am angry and I don't want to be angry, and alcohol is the quickest way to get there. So of course that was like a solution. And that's another thing I teach about a lot is alcohol is not the problem, it's the solution. That's why we keep doing it. So,
That's a really interesting way to think about it.
yes, if I wasn't angry, I wouldn't need the alcohol, right? So if our brain constantly sees it as the solution, then we just feel like at odds with ourselves. Well, I want it because I know
Right.
it's going to help me, um, but I know I shouldn't want it, and so you're constantly in this cognitive dissonance of like, gosh, how am I ever going to be able to survive without it if that's the solution? So getting in touch with my feelings was a big piece of it, and then also befriending the emotion. Um, I had learned through upbringing and seeing others how they managed their anger, and it was by, yelling, um, getting like pointing fingers and blame. And so I think I just picked that up and I just learned that's how you deal with anger when I didn't know there were other strategies and
Yes.
other ways to deal with anger. So it was being first aware of like my patterns, my habits. When I get angry, what do I do? Storm the fridge, pour the glass of Chardonnay, start yelling. Like this is just what I learned. Like this,
Angry housewife.
right. But then other people manage their anger differently. And that was
Mm.
such like an aha for me. Like, really, you can manage your anger differently? I haven't really seen that
That's super
role played
interesting.
in my life. And so, like, when I was working with the coach, we're like, well, what other ways can we manage the
Mhm.
anger that would still feel good? And
No.
because I'm not the type that wants to hit a pillow, the things you read about online or Dr. Google, it's like, no. But so being in the moment, saying, okay, I'm feeling anger. Okay, I could still storm the fridge if I want, and I could still yell if I want, but what are other options that are available to me? So then we started doing the emotional management piece, which was big. And then the cognitive piece came in, which that those two combined, when you combined your cognitive piece and your emotional piece, so your mind and your body, then the behavior just starts to become something
Mhm.
you pattern and becomes more automatic. So bringing in the cognitive piece looked like, why am I angry? What
Mm.
caused my anger? And really, really owning the story and the narratives that I had around that.
Yeah, so I want to backtrack just a little bit because there was a lot of good stuff there. So we're combining that emotional and the cognitive side of things. So you're first being aware, self-aware of how you're feeling, and then you're identifying that emotion, and even if people sometimes are not very good at this,
I
but you
know.
can look up like list of emotions, and that can sometimes help you pinpoint how you're actually feeling because it's like I feel bad, I don't know how I'm feeling. Okay, Google list of emotions and kind of pinpoint how you're feeling. And then bringing in I also think when you're feeling that, think through any physical sensations. Like I mentioned earlier, when I was like in that stress, fight or flight, my heart was beating fast. I was sweating. I felt tense. Like there was just like a tightness in my chest, not like I'm having a heart attack, but like, you know what I mean?
Mhm.
And so I'm getting used to those physical sensations. So if there's physical sensations associated with the emotion, I think that that's another helpful thing, another cue that you can use to kind of help identify the emotions. But then we're bringing in the cognitive, but I wanted to dig in a little bit more about what you said about how to deal with the anger. You said, growing up, I just saw people yelling. But how did you learn how to deal with anger in a way that didn't need, like, so that you didn't need the wine and you didn't yell?
Yeah.
What did that look like for you?
Yeah. So we would oftentimes play out the scenarios. And so
Okay.
I would bring a real life scenario when I was getting coached. So my anger, I did this is what happened. And it would always drive a wedge, whoever I was angry at, my husband, my daughter, whatever. And so we started looking at, okay, is that type of anger management effective for what you want to do? And I think that was important because when you just tell people like swap out alcohol for teas, stop yelling, like if we don't see that like the pattern and what we're going to do instead is going to
Yeah.
be helpful or not helpful. So it's so helpful to take it to the end. Um so telling somebody what to do, I don't always think is the best way. It's really finding out what's going to work for that person. So I was highlighting that what I was doing was ineffective and it was causing people to get more angry at me. And so if they're yelling at me and I'm role playing, it's okay to yell because I'm doing it too. Then I'm like
Right.
training people, it's okay to yell because I'm doing it. And I would get really, really mad when my daughter yelled at me because she's 5, right? And I'm thinking, "You're disrespectful to your parents. How can I not teach you that you don't yell at your parents?" All of that. And so I was getting more mad because of the cognitive thoughts that were
Yeah.
fueling the emotional. Um, so that was another level of awareness. So there was multiple levels to the feelings work because I think a lot of people just think emotions, "Oh, once I feel it, then what?" But
Exactly.
there's more to it. There's the cognitive adding to it as well, that once the emotion started, you're adding to it or you're subtracting from it. So
Yep.
I didn't realize that my brain was adding more anger to my body.
Yep. I think especially for parenting too. I have a great friend, Kate, and she's such a wonderful parent. So she's kind of my parenting go-to. And I texted her once and I was like, Dawson is like being so frustrating, not listening. And she's like, just remember, at the time he's 5, now he's 6, and he's not doing this intentionally to frustrate you. Like,
Yeah.
yes, he's making you feel frustrated, but that's not his intention. And so, like you just said, the story that I could tell myself is he's being so disrespectful. And
Yes.
then that adds to the anger. Or, he's a good kid having a hard time. That's like a classic from Dr. Becky's book, Good Inside,
Yeah.
which is parenting book. And like that. So, whatever story we're telling ourselves behind the emotion about the emotion that we're feeling, like you just said, can fuel it or it can like put out the fire.
Mhm.
Um, but I'm gonna press you on this a little bit more.
Mhm.
When you feel angry now, what do you do?
Mhm. I say, "Wow, there is anger inside of my body." If I don't, I just get sucked into it. So it's kinda like that Viktor Frankl, "Take the pause," and other people who talk about take the pause. And for me, that pause is owning it, where I'm not saying, "My daughter's now causing my anger." It
Yeah.
I don't wanna blame because then my brain will just go into a spiral. It's like, okay, just understand what you're feeling, and I'm like, "Oh, there's the anger," or "I'm angry inside. I'm feeling angry inside." So that's my pause, is the recognition and the awareness. And then when I have that, I think, "Okay, what is the result I want of whatever I have the anger over?" So if it's a discussion with my daughter, I want the result to be whatever comes out of mom's mouth is said lovingly. So sometimes the anger, the way I manage it is I might need a timeout. I might need like take myself out of the room because I can't calm down to speak out of love. Um, or I might want to teach, right? So sometimes that's not the appropriate time to teach in that
Mhm.
moment because they're elevated in their emotions, I'm
Right.
elevated, and we just miss. So I'll notice, okay, am I calm enough where I'm not going to teach? Am I calm enough where I could speak out of love? And if I'm not, I have to remove, well, I don't have to. I choose to remove myself from that space. If I can't, because we're in the car, I said, I'm just not going to talk about this at the moment. I just want a time to think what's going on in my body, and I will let you know when I want to continue this conversation. So that might be a strategy if I can't leave physically. If I am able just to, like, okay, this is anger. I don't want to speak in anger. I want to speak out of love. And I'm able to do that in the moment. I'll stay in that moment.
Okay. Do you ever feel like you need to get it out of you? Like, there was a time where I've told this story on the podcast, I think once before. Um, I had taken the kids to Arkansas, I believe it was, for a wedding without my husband because he was planting. And it's a long time, like traveling with,
Mm,
a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old at the time to a new place was a stressful weekend. Um, and then we got home and I just was like at my wit's end.
mhm,
And Dawson was like yelling at Leah and just like, I just can't anymore. And I
mhm,
went in her closet and I put my hands on the walls and I screamed as loud as I could. And
mm,
I was just like, I gotta get this anger out of me. And
mhm,
I screamed, and both kids like came running in, like, Mommy, are you okay? And I
mm,
was like, am I ready to respond? Nope. So I let out another like huge scream. I pushed against the wall as hard as I could that my muscles cramped up.
mm,
And I was like, I was feeling very, and then, and I was like, I'm fine. I was feeling very angry and I didn't want to yell at you guys. So I decided just to yell at the wall. But I was just kind of wondering, like, have you ever experienced that where it's just like sometimes I'll go exercise or I'll go for a walk or
yes,
like moving my body
yes.
or like using my muscles, even if it's just to tense up against a wall. Um, do you ever have any experience is like that, or do you have clients that just feel like they need to release it physically somehow?
Yes, yes, really good. And Morgan, like, that's so healthy, right? The way you handled
I
that was so
tried.
healthy.
I'm like, "I didn't wanna yell at you guys."
Right.
So
And
I
you
yelled at the
explained
wall.
to them, right, why you had this erratic behavior that doesn't make sense to their little minds, right?
No.
Totally. And you owned your emotions and you owned that you're angry. Like, I think
Mm.
if more adults did that and then explained it to kids, we would see more examples of how to manage anger, right? Even say, like, I am so angry right now, I don't know what to do. And I might just jog in place or just do jumping jacks. Or, ever see a
Mhm.
dog who sees another dog and they get angry and then they walk away and they have to do the shake? Like, it's like,
No, but that's a good point.
they just shake, you have to shake it off. So I think any way that you are moving, it's all anger is just hyped up energy
Yeah.
that's trapped, right? And so any way that you can untrap that energy by moving, by shaking. Some people take boxing classes. Sometimes people do cardio kickboxing and they're like,
Mm.
just getting the anger out at my boss today, like, and it's true. If it's this energy that's in your space that you're holding in your body, that's only going
Right.
to cause more dis-ease, right? Not to be at ease. So if we that could generate disease, right? High blood pressure,
Right.
tachycardia, all the things. So I think it's so healthy to expel it when you feel it needs to get out of your body. Yeah,
Like in a safe
in
way.
safe ways.
In
Yeah.
a safe way. I asked my grandma once, she's still alive, but papa's not. And I was like, I always admired their marriage so much. And I was like, "Nana, what's the secret to a healthy, happy marriage?" And she was like, "You find a good tree and you yell at that tree." I love that.
Yeah.
I have another question too. So you said that disappointment and anger were two of your big emotions, but just from members that I've talked to, I feel like loneliness and people that I know, I
Mm,
think loneliness is a really big emotion that drives drinking behavior.
mm,
So how would you coach somebody through the emotion of loneliness?
yeah.
Like kind of like we just did with anger.
Yeah. Yeah, I like this one because it is real. And I really think getting in touch with what about that loneliness feels awful. right? Is it lack of companionship? Is it I have companionship, but I don't have somebody who truly sees me and knows me, right? Because we could be lonely in
Right.
relationships because
Totally.
they're doing their thing and we feel
Mhm.
forgotten about, or we say something to our spouse and we have to say it 16 times because we don't feel heard. So I really like to get the flavor of the loneliness. Is it a lack of seeing and being heard? And then also defining who can provide what you need, because sometimes I feel we rely just on one person for all of
Mhm.
it. But that's really not how we're designed. And so, you know, what do you need from this person? What would feel good from this person? And then what do you need from maybe others, and how to cultivate those? Because sometimes I think the loneliness is one thing, but then there's a level beyond that. It's like, well, I don't know how I'm going to actually not be lonely. Like, I
Mhm.
don't find myself making friends or going and doing different things. Or when I'm at events, I don't allow myself to open up to make those friendships or make
Or
some.
use alcohol to loosen
Yeah.
up, like you said, as a social lubricant, so it's like,
Yes.
that's tricky.
And here's the thing, when my clients and friends will say, "Yeah, whenever I use alcohol to loosen up," and then I talk to that person the next time and we're sober or I'm sober, I don't know if I really like them as much. So we feel it helps us, but of course, in excess, we just get goggles on of some sorts, and it just prevents us from, like, really seeing the true them and if there's a true connection.
Yeah. So what would you suggest for somebody who maybe is craving, like, companionship,
Mhm.
and they're trying to meet people, but they feel like they're not connecting with anybody. And so that feeling of loneliness
Mm,
is activating the craving for alcohol.
mm.
What does that person do in the moment? You kind of mentioned that learning how to
Mhm,
control those urges was
mhm,
really important.
mhm,
So let's say that they're doing their best to find that companionship,
mhm,
but it's still not there yet.
mhm.
How do they control the urges as they are working on addressing the loneliness?
Yeah, yeah, so the urges, I love, the expression of just, like, being with it, because when you're with it and you allow it, it it starts to dissolve.
Mm,
So sometimes I don't mind the word control, but sometimes I hear women saying, I'm controlling, I'm trying to control it, I'm kind of controlling it. And what they're doing is they're distracting themselves with laundry, or I'm just going to go for a walk every time I get an urge, or I'm just going to have tea every time. And so by doing other things, not that there's not some relief. However, like if it's raining outside, or maybe you don't even like tea, if you're constantly distracting yourself and telling yourself that the urge is something bad,
right.
that level of controlling it actually doesn't work, because that's using like more willpower and that's a finite resource. So I say, like, well, just allow it to enter. Now you could still do laundry, you could still do other things, but just don't be afraid of it,
Mhm.
because it's like the boogeyman. If you're no longer afraid of it, it just kind of disappears. It kind of just subtly starts to lessen over time. So it could go from a 9 to an 8 to a 6. And over time, it just starts to lessen. And now, a lot of people, if they have trouble with alcohol, they'll say, I have my witching hours, right? Mine were like
Yeah.
5 to 7. But if I made it through those 2 hours, I didn't have any urges the rest of the night. Now, some people, they might be shorter witching hours, they might be longer, there might be two sets. So but my witching hours became much less when I was like, "Oh, here's the craving. Of course, my body for years has gotten alcohol at this time. Of course, it's gonna be craving. Of course, it wants to just say, 'Hey, you're used to giving me sugar at this time or alcohol at this time, and why aren't you?'" But then over time, your body learns to adapt a new pattern. It goes back to homeostasis. It goes back to wanting to be healthy. And so over time, those cravings just diminish and diminish till they're gone.
Yeah, I love that witching hour. I mean, I have young kids, so we had some witching hours up in here, for many years, but I've never thought of that for sugar. Like,
Mhm.
5 to 7 is definitely my witching hours for sugar intake because we had dessert every night after dinner, and, Doctor Richard Johnson's book, Nature Wants Us to Be Fat, did a really good job explaining how alcohol and sugar, like, have a similar craving in the mind.
Yeah.
And so many people who quit alcohol then turn to sugar.
Yes.
And I don't we can get into that too, but just recognizing there's a very similar craving mechanism for the fructose, and each of them is important. And I think that that's another little mini goal that people can start to implement is like, I'm going to make it through the witching hour. If
Mhm.
I'm going to have sugar, I'm not having it until, the end of my witching hour, or like just to practice that self-discipline muscle and that self-awareness muscle. But I mean, ideally they don't. Like they get through that window and then they don't crave it anymore. But what's your advice to people who do experience that reduction in alcohol intake, but then they've just like swapped one craving for a different with sugar?
Yeah, I've seen this a lot with clients who come to me after bariatric surgery. They're like,
Mm,
I was, using food, food, food. Now that I don't want the food, I turn to alcohol. And it used to be just half a glass because that's
mm,
all, I needed and that's all I wanted. And now it's a lot more than that. And they're just noticing, gosh, they just swapped out alcohol for food. And it's to me, they just didn't learn the skills that were needed. The surgery, sure, will help, but there's also skills that are needed. So, learning to again manage your emotions, learning what those are, or some people will call them triggers. All triggers are just emotions that your body has been trained that you use this substance to solve.
yeah.
Once you give the body the skills it needs to manage the anger, handle the loneliness, you're like, "Oh, it's just skills that I need." And one of those skills is mastering your emotions, and that's a key component I talk about a lot in my podcast and in my programs, because if we are always at, the end of those emotions and allowing those emotions to control us, we will always get further and further away from our
Mhm.
goals. Yeah.
Yeah, that friend Kate that I was mentioning earlier, my parenting friend,
Mhm.
she had a really good thing too, where it's like when I was talking to her about snapping at the kids, and she was like, "Pay attention, like, it's almost like a cliff, like, when you get to the
Yes.
cliff, that's your snapping point." She's like, "Pay attention to how far you're getting towards the end of the cliff
Yes.
and create a boundary that's well before the end of the cliff." And
Right.
I think that's been really effective for me communicating with my children is I'm gonna have that boundary far before my snapping point.
Mhm.
And I don't know why I didn't think of that before, but that was really helpful for me. I wanted to dig into a little bit more. You said, emotional mastery is so important. I say the exact same thing. And I think that that comes down to the cognitive skills that you were talking about. So we talked about the emotional side of things, but let's dig into some of the cognitive skills that are really beneficial for people to build in order to master those emotions.
Yeah. The cognitive skills I love to start with is just questioning our own thinking. So much, whether we picked it up from teachers or people who've parented us or, pharmacy school or the medical system or wherever you have spent a ton of time, right? We learn by others, right? We model others. And so we have similar beliefs. And so I think it's really just important to think, okay, what are the beliefs I'm having about that? And is it true? What you mentioned when we both had a similar situation with a 5-year-old yelling at us and we found it disrespectful. Is it really true? Right. And like
Yeah.
you said, Kate was like, I'm sure they're not trying to be disrespectful. That's not their intent.
Mhm.
So when I really saw that it wasn't my daughter's intent to disrespect me, it was, she's trying to like just like get her point across. And I've taught her we just speak louder when it comes to conversation and one's really heated about being right. And so just seeing like, well, why does she raise her voice? Why do I think she raises her voice? Is it to be disrespectful? So the cognitive piece is really starting to look at what are the narratives I have and that I'm believing, and are they really true? Kind of got diving into Byron Katie's work where she has the 4 principles, and one of her 4 questions is like, is that really true?
Mhm.
And it's like, wow, once I understood she's not doing it to be disrespectful, I was able to understand her better and then also how to solve the problem.
Yep. So I think that's a really lovely series of questions. Like, I like to say, like, what story am I telling myself about this emotion, or what thoughts are behind this emotion?
Mhm,
And then saying, like, are those thoughts true? Are
mhm,
they rational?
mhm.
So where do we go like after that first set of observational questions? What are
Yeah.
some other cognitive questions or skills?
Yeah, so and then, so once you kind of I don't love to go right to the solution,
Mhm.
um, because people will hear, "Then I just do this, then I just do this," right? And if you give people just a platter of things to do, they think that's the solution, but oftentimes they have trouble taking action on those actions. So I love to just say, "Oh, stay in that. Is this true? Is this true? Has this helped me in the past? Have I seen this work? Or am I just doing the definition of insanity, trying the same thing over and over?" Right. So I really like to see it play out to like, okay, if this is not true, why isn't it? Or if this is true and I'm handling it this way, is that working? Right. So is it true? Is what I'm doing currently working? So I can really see it play out the whole movie. Then moving into, okay, if I could see this a different way, what other way can I see it? Is there a solution in this way of seeing it that I can take that action? So if I say, yeah, but it's like I don't get angry. Well, no, I can't take that action because there's
Yeah.
actually anger inside my body. So then I have to like, okay, that one's not going to work. So then I go back to the cognitive processing again. Okay, if I can't take that action or that's impossible, and this is happening what's inside my body, what action would I be willing to take? What action would I think would get me the result that I want?
Mhm. I think that's good, and I'm guessing then you have like a series of actions that you can take
Mhm.
for each emotion that somebody's experiencing. I think that's wonderful.
And
You had a really Oh, did you have something else to add
yeah,
there?
and I was gonna say sometimes you might not know the answer,
Mm,
um, but trying different things, or if you are in this is something that happens with somebody else, you can also pull them in. So one of
yeah.
the things, that was really impactful, I thought I knew more than a 5-year-old, right? It's like, she's not gonna know, but what one time I'm just like, "Well, maybe I'll ask her." I'm like, "When we get in a heated argument and I just wanna yell back at you, what would be better?"
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
she just told me what would be better, and I'm like, "Okay, I've been trying to solve this, thinking I know more than you," and she just gave me the answer. And I was
Mhm.
just like, "Well, that's something I can do." And
But
then
what
she
about like, that's such a great question though. Like, I don't
Yeah.
want people to overlook that if they're having tensions in relationships.
Yes.
Bless my husband's heart, that's exactly what he did this morning. He was like, "What can I do so that you don't feel this way?" And
Yes.
I'm like, "I don't know. This is not the time to talk about it. I'm still in the fight or flight. We're gonna have to revisit this later." But that's a super powerful question if you're having some disconnection with somebody is like, "What can I do? How could I respond that would make you feel better?"
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
really nice piece of advice there. All right, you had a really good question that I wanted you to answer, and that is, why is it easier to start a good habit versus break a bad habit? Because I thought that was such an interesting point of view.
I love this question so much because I think it is so easy for us to do a good habit or start a habit than it is to break a habit. If you have a bad habit, you've probably been doing it a while. For
Mhm,
my over drinking, I was probably going on 7, 8 years of over drinking before I was ready to take like serious amount of action on it. Like I did things myself, but I'm like, okay, if I'm not helping myself get any further in this, I obviously need outside help. So that's to me when I got super serious. I'm like, okay, I'm going to do all I can, look at all the things that I can do to like really conquer this. And so I had what, 7, 8 years learned that alcohol is my solution to anger and disappointment. It's what I use to distress. It's what I used as a social lubricant. So that means I lost all those years on how to manage certain skills, how
mhm,
to talk to people at a party that I don't know anybody else but the host, kind of lost that skill. I relied on alcohol to loosen me up. And then that made me feel safe or made me feel Like I can now attempt conversation.
Or, like,
So
it numbed your anxiety enough where you
exactly.
didn't care about that social anxiety anymore.
Exactly. So
Mhm.
breaking a bad habit takes a while. And so when people say, "Oh, habit change takes 64 days," or whatever, I'm like, "Well, maybe if you've never had a bad habit that you're breaking and you're just learning to, like, eat more vegetables, like, sure, that may be quicker and easier, but to break a bad habit, depending on how long you've had it, you've got a lot of neurocircuitry and neuroplasticity to work with or work against, and build new neuron connections while those others are being pruned away. So it's not as easy, I find, for people to break bad habits as it is just to start a new habit.
I agree with that. Yeah, and I think that sometimes I really like the habit stacking technique, like
Yeah.
stack a good habit like around the time that you're trying to stop your bad habit. So kind of like doing a habit replacement, I think can be helpful.
Mhm.
But I want everybody to just replace the word sugar with alcohol throughout this conversation. I should have prefaced that because, sugar can be a social lubricant. Sugar can be your best friend at night. Sugar can be the way that you unwind too, not just
Mm.
alcohol.
Mhm.
And so I think I want this conversation to be like widely applicable to people, whether it's alcohol or whether it's sweet stuff that you're struggling with. Another question I wanted to ask you is what advice would you give to somebody who just knows they have a problem,
Mhm.
but doesn't feel like they have the motivation
Mm.
or the bandwidth to deal with the problem. And they're like, I just can't. Like, I just can't.
Yeah.
What would you tell them?
Yeah. I hear you. I know you. I see you. That was me. I told you for many years, I saw the problem growing little by little, but I wasn't willing to do anything about it. It had to get a little worse for me to be like, okay, I could see where this train is headed, and I don't want to be there. Luckily, nothing bad happened. Luckily, no DUIs, nothing, anything like tragic. So I want people to hear you don't have to hit bottom. I think that's a myth that a lot of people believe. Like, you have to wait for the liver diagnosis to be elevated, or you don't have to wait. And if it's not your time, it's not your time. Um, and sometimes just giving yourself that um, level of like, is it my time? It's not my time. And then they back off on it. Then the shoulds drop. And then all of a sudden, they find a day later, they're motivated because they stop shoulding on themselves. I
Yeah,
should want to
same.
care. I should want to lose weight. I should want to stop sugar. I would should on myself all the time. I know the stats. I'm a healthcare person. Why do I have this over drinking problem? Right? Like I should want to change it. But if I just stepped back and said, okay, I'm not going to change it. I'm not willing to change it. Gosh, within a couple of hours or the next day, I'm like, that doesn't feel good. I want to change it. And it
Mhm.
gave me motivation. So I think giving yourself space to just take the brakes off and the shoulds off, you might find that, like, oh, the motivation was just buried under the
Yeah,
shoulds.
I
Yeah.
like that. The motivation was buried under the shoulds.
Yeah.
I would ask them to go a step further too and just say, okay, like it's not my time right now. And then ask, why isn't it my time right now?
Mm-hmm.
And kind of dig through what other things kind of come
Hmm.
up in your mind.
Hmm.
Um, I think that's a really nice question. Why isn't it my time right now?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because I think sometimes those first level thoughts are lies. And we need
Absolutely.
to dig a little bit deeper and maybe dig up some of our excuses and then kind of look at them like they're a little fossil and be like, is this something that I want to hold on to? Like, is this true? Nope.
Mhm.
Okay. Well, why else isn't it my time? Oh, is this one true? Nope. Okay. Well, I'm out of excuses. I guess it is my time.
Yeah.
So I think that sometimes that could be people's experience too. If they're so used to telling themselves it's not my time, that's become like a pattern of thought that
Yeah.
just digging a little bit deeper too, like with grace, with self-compassion.
Yeah.
And sometimes, yeah, sometimes it just might not be your time, but let's explore that and be curious about it.
And speaking of
Um,
that, I would add on, because now you're getting, through all the excuses, and sometimes you get to the end of the excuses, but you're still not motivated. Maybe
yeah,
another question to add on to that would be, well, when is my time? Because now
yeah,
you're inviting in possibility, you're inviting in, when would I wanna act on that?
mhm,
And I like, thinking even far out, well, am I gonna work on that when I'm 60? Or how about 55? And, start bringing it closer and closer. I think a lot of people will say, I'll start tomorrow. I'll start tomorrow. I'll start tomorrow. And tomorrow never comes. But really give yourself like permission to play with different time frames and see if you can generate motivation by doing that
Yeah.
when
I
it's
also think that people sometimes wait for motivation to be a trigger or an activator to take action,
Mhm.
and recognizing that we do most of the actions in a day without being motivated to do them. So I think questioning that belief that we have to be motivated to start is helpful too. Like, I was not motivated to unload the dishwasher. I wasn't really motivated to like make my bed or brush my teeth. I wasn't really motivated to like get dressed, you know? But these become
100%. Yeah,
yes, they become habitual parts of our behavior, so
yes,
questioning the belief in the first place that you have to be motivated to take action, or you can just, like, do it without the emotional attachment to the motivation,
agreed,
and I
agreed.
love digging into those attachments, I think is very interesting.
100%. And when I'm working with clients, I actually say motivation is not the energy that we actually want, it's commitment. I don't
Yes,
care about motivation, commitment's gonna get you further towards your goals.
I love that. I
Yeah.
think that's such a great place to wrap up on. Is there any other tips or things that you wanted to share today before you drop, like, where people can learn more about you and work with you?
Yeah, I think it's really important that, we just become aware of our patterns. Some of them really serve us, making our beds, emptying the dishwasher, brushing our teeth. They really serve our health. They really serve our joy. They really serve other purposes. So not all patterns, not all habits have to change. And then really diving into like, okay, what habits do I want to change or what patterns do I want to change? Because I think it's really helpful to like start this process because it's not an overnight thing, and that's okay, right? And then just finding your tribe to get you there. Like
Yeah.
what are the people that you want to surround yourself with who you can learn from and inspire so you can get there because it makes the journey easier. We are not
Mhm.
meant to do all journeys alone. I think that's
Yeah.
where I was for a long time. It's toxic independence. That's what I suffer from. I think I have to do it all my way, myself. It's hard for me to ask for help. But really, when I do ask for help, when I do release some of that, right, I'm able to grow quicker and change faster. And then finding that community to do so, to be supported.
I think a lot of eyebrows just did what mine did, which was like, up. Like, toxic independence is I have that. So thanks for bringing that to light, and that was just beautifully said. So where can people learn more about you and work with you?
Yes, I have a podcast called Health Habits and Epic Living. You can find that anywhere you find podcasts. And my website is Epic You, EPICYOU, Epic You. And I have multiple coaching programs for different things you may be struggling with if you want to check out those. And then on Instagram, I'm at Dr. Sherry Price.
Awesome. Well, I really enjoyed our conversation today. I hope that people gleaned the importance of having a curious mindset and an observer mindset to their emotions. Maybe they gained a few tools along the way on how they can identify what emotions they're experiencing, sit with them, befriend them, and then add that cognitive component of exploring those emotions and what thoughts are creating those emotions and what story are you telling yourself about those emotions. And, I think most importantly, stop relying on motivation and start that's not the vibe. Like, that's not the vibe. We wanna come from that commitment, not necessarily have an attachment to motivation in order to act on anything. So, I very much enjoyed our conversation today. Thank you.
Thank you, Morgan.